Hello, my name's Ian, and this is Somerset News Network. Now, Zelensky from Ukraine is on his way to Washington. Starmer is on his way to Washington, along with Macron, they report. Now, Starmer talked about the coalition of the willing to keep the war going and allow more people to die. Get it? Question is why? Now this little video is my take on the Ukraine war. I pick up little bits of information and I try and make a pattern out of it, and I try and make sense of it. We can't rely on the mainstream media. You know, you watch the BBC or Sky and they report things, you say, hang on a minute, that ain't true. And they twist things. There's YouTube channels explaining how the Ukraine is winning the war. You know, before Christmas, they were talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of drones going to Ukraine. And they're going to blow hell out of the Russians, you know. Well, Ukraine did take a part of Russia, one little segment. The Russians weren't ready for them. The Russians pulled back. And there was about 20,000 troops in the area on Russian soil. Ukraine's gonna win. Ukraine's teaching Russia a lesson. Then Russia fought back. And a lot of those men were lucky to get out of there alive. Russia has changed its tactics of warfare. NATO and the way we train with modern warfare, we're about 20 years behind the times. So the Americans were funding Ukraine. You had USAID giving money to NGOs, and NGOs were giving it to Ukraine. And Ukraine were buying bombs and bullets. Now, one of the main companies that has shares in most of the industrial military complex is BlackRock. They own most of the arms companies in America. It's in their interest to keep the war going so they can sell bombs and bullets. You see where I'm going with this? We're taking little bits of information. Now, you've got to remember that Starmer met with BlackRock in number 10, and we don't know what was talked about. Then Starmer comes out and gets a deal with Ukraine for 100 years for its rare earth minerals. Starmer now has a problem with that, and we'll go into that later. But we got Macron, the Germans, and the Canadians, along with Starmer, as the coalition of the willing. Like I said, the willing to allow more people to die. Now, the other thing you got to understand is how this war started. We're being told that the Russians are invading Ukraine. The Russians are going into Ukraine, but it's not an invasion. At the start of the war, around the Crimea and the southern Ukraine, there are mainly Russian-speaking people. There was a regime change when Zelensky took power. That was organized by the CIA and MI6 as military experts are saying. Now, they changed the regime, and when it started, before the war started, there was like a skirmish, and there was rebels in Ukraine attacking the Russian-speaking people in Crimea. They basically wanted to ethnically cleanse Crimea from Russian-speaking people. Now that's the start of the war. And then it's Ukraine troops fighting the Crimean. So the Russians came in and were invited in by the Crimean people to protect them. That's how this war started. Now you've got NATO and France, Germany, Britain, like I said, and Boris Johnson's involved in this as well. And I don't think Trump was in his time. I think it was more Biden. Because we know that Hunter Biden was a director of Burisma, who was the oil company of Ukraine. Now, what was going on there? The prosecutor for Ukraine, President Biden as vice president under Obama, got her, I can't remember, actually sacked. And Obama says it on stage. I managed to get the prosecutor sacked. We'll stop giving them money if she's still in her job. Well, she was going to have a go at Burisma. Now, we don't know what Burisma was up to. There's been speculation, but it don't sound very good. And Hunter Biden's involved in it. Hunter Biden's a director of Burisma because they are using the influence with his old man, Joe Biden. Then he becomes president of the United States. Now, what's going on? We speculate there. But we're giving Ukraine, or allowing Ukraine, to buy second-hand weapons from Europe and America, and bombs and bullets and missiles, and they even put the Patriot system over there, the American anti-missile missiles. Now, we gave them our Chieftain tanks, Mark II, which we built in the 70s. Now, if you wanted a second-hand tank, now I deal with antique firearms and DIAC firearms, and I deal with people who have got sections 5s, which is machine guns and things like that, and they do stuff for television and films, and they also got a few tanks. Now, one guy was buying German tanks with a deacted barrel, which we then test and give them a certificate for. Basically, you're going to block the barrel up and stop the mechanism working, the same as I would on a pistol or a rifle. But I don't deal in tanks. He was buying second-hand tanks for £40,000. When the war in Ukraine started, they were replacing the deact gun on the tanks, putting a new one in, and selling it back to Ukraine for £400,000. Do you see the profit that can be made by this? And it wasn't just one tank. It was 20, 30, 40 tanks. There's big money involved. And because Ukraine has got the money from America, they're funneling the money through in bombs and bullets. the Patriot system that they got for knocking down incoming missiles aren't worth anything in Ukraine. The Russians are using hyper missiles. They go at Mach 5 plus. By the time the radar has picked it up, it's too late. They haven't got time to send the missiles up. Now, if these missiles are that fast and they can't intercept them, causes trouble. The Russians also pick up on the radar on the anti-missile units and then send a drone in and blow them all up. Trump stopped sending them because they're useless. Now, when it comes to warfare, NATO is training Ukraine in tactics that are 20 years old or more. We've now got drones on the battlefield. Yes, Ukraine has been using these drones, but the Russians have managed to design countermeasures. They can pick up the drones, they can use radar, they can jam it to stop them working. And what the Russians do on the front line is, one military analyst said, the Russians do not allow the Ukrainians to have a target. In other words, they don't go forward with men until the ground in front of them is cleared. And what they do is they use a drone in the sky as a spotter. And then they have a bank of kamikaze drones to knock out the opposition, either military vehicles or bunkers full of men. Now, if they give up and wave the white flag, the Russians take him in. Now, we're told the Russians really look after them. You know, they're not treated as prisoners of war. They're treated as friendly cousins, because they are. They're Russian-speaking people still. So, Russia has changed its tactics. And Ukraine doesn't know what to do. And slowly, the Russians are moving west and north and taking more and more of Ukraine. Now, Trump came to power in January and wanted a ceasefire and wanted to get a peace deal. The Russians wanted to hold on to the ground that they had in southeast Ukraine and the Crimea. Trump understood that they actually hold the ground. So he knew that they would be removed. And he tried to get a deal. Zelensky and Starmer and Macron and Canada persuaded him to carry on, and they would fund it. So the war continued, and we didn't get a peace deal. Now this map is Ukraine in January 2025. Now take a look at this map. This is today's map of Ukraine, and all the pink and the red is Russian-held territory. It's grown. Northeast has been taken, and they're slowly creeping west. So the longer this goes on, the more ground the Russians are taking. If Zelensky had agreed to a peace deal, he would have more of his own country now. because he refused, because of the backing of Starmer, who's now got blood on his hands, he's lost more ground. And the peace talks that are going on now, the Russians ain't giving up any land. They're talking about a land swap. Well, it hasn't been swapped. It's been taken. And it's been taken in a war. Now, on mainstream media today, this morning, on the news, they're talking about the Russians attacking Ukraine and 18 people being killed. Well, the peace talks are going on as if it's something bad. It's a war that's going on. Ukraine hasn't stopped fighting. What do you expect the Russians to do? Sit on their hands and let the Ukrainians win? Now, I'm not pro-Russian. I was brought up as the Russians being a bogeyman. I was in the Air Cadets, and I worked with the military, and everybody in the NATO sphere was geared up and trained to fight the Russians because we were worried about a communist invasion. Well, we haven't had a communist invasion. We voted a communist in, Mr. Starmer. So that worked out, didn't it? So I'm not pro-Russian. I just want logic and the truth. As John Lennon said, all I want is the truth. And you can't make things up. Ukraine is not going to win this war. The longer it continues, the more ground Russia will take, and they will not give it back. It's that simple. It ain't rocket science. You know, they were talking about sending 2,000 British troops out. Well, they wouldn't have lasted very long, would they? Putting our men in harm's way, coming back in body bags, not good. And Starmer's all willing and for it. But you voted for him. Well, not you personally, but the woke people voted for him, thinking we were going to have a brave new world. And all we've been left with is tyranny. Real tyranny. You know, they're now taking down English flags in Birmingham. They've banned the St. George's flag in Birmingham. Might be offensive. I remember there was a Sikh on a horse, and he's decked out in St. George's flags. He's a patriot. You know, anything that might offend somebody is now in the woke new world breaking the law. Well, it isn't. You can have a point of view. They just want to try and stop you doing it. You know, so this map here is the second map I've got. And this is a map of today. As you can see, the Russians are more up northeast and creeping over to the west in the middle there. This isn't going to stop. The only way we can get a real good peace deal, good for all of us, is for Zelensky to step down, have proper elections in Iraq, let the people decide. I think they've had enough of war. There was one Ukraine politician said there was 400,000 army personnel have gone AWOL, absent without leave. They've left the battlefield and they don't want to return. And that was a Ukrainian MP said that. So there are Ukrainian people that are against the war. But like in Britain, we've got Starmer controlling everything and the police doing his bidding, as the Stasi police. And then we've got Antifa coming in and causing trouble, and they're blaming the far right when it's the far left. And they're being used like Hitler's brown shirts against the people. And this is all on the background of the Ukraine war still going on. We have to agree to a peace deal to start with, to a ceasefire. Ceasefire and halt. That's the first thing we got to do. Then we got to persuade Zelensky that his days are numbered and they want new elections in Ukraine. Then the Russians will step back and let democracy take its course. Now, it's more than likely going to be pro-Russian MPs that get elected if they don't rig the election. You know, God knows what the CIA and MI6 are going to do. So don't believe all you see on mainstream media. Where's the peace movement? Nowhere to be seen. Because the peace movement was organised by the left wing. And Starmer is left wing. They're communists. That's what they want. You can't make this up. So the peace movement's nowhere to be seen. And if they do march, they don't get any press anyway. Anyway, that's my take on the Ukraine war. I don't think I'm too far from the truth. And let's hope we can get peace. We can't go on like this. And Starmer's deal, his 100-year deal with Ukraine, where's that now? Russians got all this ground, and most of the rare earth minerals are under the ground the Russians have got. So what's Starmer going to do with his precious 100-year deal? Anyway, Ian, I've said enough. Signing off, and bye-bye for now.